Chapter 36 covers reproduction and development, and we're going to be covering sections 1, 3, and 4 of this chapter. So animal reproduction takes on many forms. We're going to learn about asexual and sexual reproduction, internal and external reproduction. A population can only continue by outliving its members only through reproduction. If we don't reproduce, populations die, organisms and species go extinct. There are two types of reproduction, main types of reproduction, sexual and asexual reproduction. In sexual reproduction, offspring is created when sperm and egg fuse and form what is called a zygote. Zygote is the first stages of a living being. Asexual reproduction occurs without the fusion of the egg and the sperm. Egg may still be involved, but there is no fusion with the sperm. There's a lot of types of asexual reproduction that are only found in invertebrates because those are much more primitive animals than vertebrates are. And one of these examples is called budding. And so that's where like new individuals are just growths of an existing one. So like imagine coral, right? It's a budded growth of an offspring. Also common among invertebrates is fission. Fission is different. It's where a mother divides and becomes two. So the parent goes away and what results is two individuals of equal size. Fragmentation is breaking down of the body pieces. And then so some of the body pieces break down and they'll turn into adults. But in order for it to be true fragmentation, to happen, you have to regenerate that body part that is lost. Parthenogenesis is the development of a new individual from an unfertilized egg. So the egg is still involved, but the egg is unfertilized. And this is a form of asexual reproduction that happens in some vertebrates. It's basically identical clones of yourself because there's no additional genetic material that is involved. Sexual females will have half as many daughter cells as asexual females do, theoretically. We know that you're probably part of a family that has more females than males do, or more males even than females do. But theoretically, you have a 50% chance of having a male and a female if you perform sexual reproduction. And even because of this, we still will reproduce sexually because there are some benefits to sexual reproduction. So in asexual reproduction, if this female is going through parthenogenesis and produces two identical offspring, these identical offspring are female who are also going to produce identical offspring. So at the end of the fourth generation, you have, you have 8 offspring from your initial female, but they're all identical in their genetics. In sexual reproduction, if you have 2 offspring, one statistically should be female and one should be male. And then that one female is also producing one female male, so on and so forth. And so at the end of the 4th generation, you have far fewer offspring than those who produced asexually. But sexual reproduction results in offspring of varied genotypes. And this is important because this increases variation among offspring and could enhance reproductive success, especially if there are changing environments. So let's pretend that whatever this female is adapted to cold temperatures. And over time, this area where they live in stops being cold and it now becomes warm. Well, if she can't live in warm temperatures, neither can her offspring. And so you may not ever make it to generation 4 by the time temperatures get too warm. Whereas whatever this female is might be adapted for warmer environments. However, her offspring now have dad's genetic material and maybe they can overcome that environmental change. That's a very simple explanation or example of changes in environment. Most animals, whether they're asexual or sexual, will exhibit reproductive cycles related to changing seasons. The cycles are controlled by hormones, but they're also controlled by environmental cues. So it may be the spring coming around, or maybe it's winter to be able to reproduce before spring happens. And because seasonal temperature is often an important cue in reproduction, we do believe that as the climate changes, this could decrease reproductive success if animals are not adapting to it. For many animals, finding a partner for sexual reproduction can be challenging, and so one solution is to be a hermaphrodite. Hermaphrodites are individuals that have both boy and girl reproductive systems. So two hermaphrodites can mate and both get pregnant, but also some hermaphrodites can fertilize themselves. So in very, severe, intense situations where they can't find partners, that would be their solution for overcoming that. Also, some animals can undergo sex reversals. So one example is this coral reef fish, the bluehead wrasse, and there's one male that will defend all the females. If that boy dies, the largest female in the group, so essentially like the alpha female, will transform into a male, so much so that she will actually start to produce sperm instead of producing eggs. Sexual reproduction requires fertilization. Fertilization is where the sperm and the egg join. There is internal and external fertilization. Internal fertilization happens with most mammals and humans, where the sperm is deposited in or near the female reproductive tract so that fertilization occurs in that tract. External fertilization is where the eggs are released by the female into the environment, so are the sperm, and they find each other. If you do external fertilization, you must have a moist habitat. Otherwise, those gametes, the egg and the sperm, are going to dry out. But also it has to be moist so that the sperm with their little tails are able to swim to the female, to the egg. And so a lot of aquatic invertebrates will utilize this as a form of fertilization or reproduction, where they just release gametes into the surrounding water and they happen to find each other. Timing is very crucial, because they have to find one another. And so if fertilization is not synchronous, then there may be some courtship behaviors, which sounds funny that they're performing courtship yet not copulating with one another, but that will still ignite them to want to release their gametes so that fertilization can happen. Internal fertilization requires more effort to find a mate and to go through the process of mating, but it ensures that the sperm will reach the egg more efficiently, especially if the external environment is dry. With fertilization, mating animals use things called pheromones. Pheromones are things that we release. Even humans have pheromones. And these chemicals are detected by our body, and that influences our behavior. So an animal that's in heat is releasing pheromones that's telling the male, I'm ready to accept you, and that's what makes the male want to mate with her. The pheromones affect their hormones and affect their behavior. Pheromones are also species specific. Internal fertilization is typically associated with the production of fewer gametes, but survival is higher. So a frog popping out a bunch of eggs, only a percentage of them are going to survive, whereas a human being born and producing a certain finite amount of eggs might be only the same amount as that frog puts out one time. But we're putting a giant effort into caring for those young, and so the survival rate is much higher. Internal fertilization is often associated with mechanisms to provide protection of embryos and parental care of the young. So some protection of those embryos would be like developing inside of an egg, a calcium-rich, hard egg that is hard to get through. Or if you're a fish or a reptile, then your egg is softer. So think about if you have sushi or you've ever had caviar, you've seen pictures of caviar, right? Those are eggs of fish, and they're very smushy. They're very gelatinous in material. Some other animals will retain the embryo, which develops inside the female. Mammals are a good example of that. Humans are a good example of that. The baby develops internally. And then, in addition to these survival mechanisms to protect the embryo, we also might exhibit parental care. And we think of that in terms of humans. We think of that in terms of dogs, cats, elephants caring for their young for a period of time and nursing them. But we also see it in other animals like insects. So this is a giant water bug. This is actually the father. The female glues her eggs to his back, and he exhibits parental care to ensure that more of his offspring will survive. We're going to skip concept 36.2, which is like anatomy of those reproductive organs in mammals, so we can kind of spare you some of that embarrassment if that's a topic that is a little more uncomfortable for you. And we're going to go into talking about interplay of tropic and sex hormones that regulate reproduction in mammals. So mammalian reproduction is coordinated by hormones found in 3 places: the hypothalamus, the anterior pituitary, and your gonads. Remember, these are organs, part of the endocrine system, that release hormones that elicit a response in your tissue or your behavior. So a gonadotropin releasing hormone, GnRH, is secreted by your hypothalamus. That then tells your anterior pituitary gland to release 2 hormones, FSH and LH, follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Both of those are tropic hormones, which means that they trigger endocrine systems to release other hormones. So understand what tropic means. So FSH, LH, these tropic hormones act on the gonads now. So it was hypothalamus, pituitary gland. Those are telling the gonads now to regulate the production of sex hormones. And the 2 main sex hormones are androgens and estrogens. Androgens are testosterone. Estrogens are progesterone and estradiol. So 2 things that we think of when we think of women. But both males and females produce both. Different percentages or different amounts are produced by males versus females, giving females a softer voice, fat deposits in certain areas, males a different look, deeper voice, Adam's apple forms, different sex organs are found, generally less fat content to their body, because they have more testosterone versus estrogens, and vice versa for the females. Sex hormones regulate gamete production both directly and indirectly. They may serve additional functions, so including sexual behavior and development of primary and secondary sex characteristics. Androgens and estrogens also stimulate specific sexual behaviors in males and females. Speaking of biology and gender identity, this has definitely been something that has become more, we've become more culturally aware of in recent years, right? So when a baby is born, it's assigned a biological sex, and its assignment is reflected in its genitalias, but also in their chromosomes, in their genes. The SRY gene, which is found on the Y chromosome, is what tells your body to produce testes. So the SRY gene on the Y chromosome says you're going to be a boy. If that is not in existence, then you develop ovaries. You are a female. So it's a specific gene on that chromosome that decides or that tells your body to produce one or the other type of gonad. There's a term called intersex. So relatively about 1 in 100 individuals is considered intersex, which means that they have male and female biological characteristics. And this may have occurred because they have a chromosome that's not the way that it should be, that is considered non-standard, or they might have the hormone-directed pathways didn't work properly that controlled and that were in control during sexual development. So sexual development didn't occur properly because the hormones took a different route. Gender identity is distinct from biological success. It's very different. So gender identity is your internal sense of what you feel like you should be. And so there are 2 terms. There are cisgender and transgender. Cisgender is somebody who is biologically female and identifies with female. Transgender is somebody who was born one sex but identifies with the other sex. So their identity doesn't match their biologically assigned sex. So gender identity is different than biological sex, is also different than sexual orientation. Sexual orientation happens regardless of what your gender identity is. So the terms are heterosexuality, homosexuality, bisexual, or asexual. Heterosexual, hetero means different. So you like someone of a different sex than you are. Homo means same, so you like someone of the same sex as you do. Bi, you like both. Asexual, you have no sexual preference. And then obviously human sexuality is highly varied, and we are probably the main organism that exhibits this gender identity and sexual orientation that varies from our biological sex. FSH and LH, those two tropic hormones, act on different cells in the testes to direct something called spermatogenesis. And so this is development of male sperm. And the two types of cells that they act on are the Sertoli cells and the Leydig cells. Sertoli are found in, we didn't talk about anatomy, so it might help you to go back to 36.2 and just take a look at what this seminiferous tubule is. But the Sertoli cells will respond to FSH and they'll start to nourish developing sperm. The Leydig cells respond to LH, and they secrete testosterone and other androgens that promote spermatogenesis, the development of sperm.
Hormones control the production of sperm and male sex hormones by the testes. The hypothalamus, the part of the brain just above the pituitary gland, controls hormone production under the influence of other parts of the brain. The hypothalamus produces a releasing hormone that regulates the secretion of follicle-stimulating hormone, FSH, and luteinizing hormone, LH, from the anterior pituitary. FSH stimulates sperm production by the testes. LH stimulates the testes to secrete androgens, male sex hormones. Testosterone is the most important androgen secreted by the testes. Androgens shape the development of the male reproductive system. They stimulate sperm production and trigger development of secondary sex characteristics such as beard growth. Negative feedback regulates the function of the male reproductive system. An increase in testosterone and other androgens inhibits the brain and pituitary, decreasing secretion of releasing hormone and LH. This in turn reduces androgen secretion. A drop in androgens allows the brain and pituitary to stimulate the testes, maintaining optimum androgen levels. Ovulation occurs about every 28 days in a regular cycle called the ovarian cycle. Hormones coordinate the ovarian cycle with monthly changes in the uterus, termed the menstrual cycle. The start of the menstrual cycle is defined by the beginning of a woman's menstrual period. The lining of the uterus, called the endometrium, breaks down, and blood, cells, and mucus are expelled through the vagina. This process is called menstruation, and it usually lasts for the first 3 to 5 days of the menstrual cycle. The endometrium again thickens in preparation for possible pregnancy. We will combine our discussion of the ovarian and menstrual cycles to show how hormones coordinate the activities of the ovaries and the uterus. The brain controls reproduction, acting via hormones produced by the pituitary gland. While a woman is menstruating, her hypothalamus begins secreting a releasing hormone which stimulates the anterior pituitary to secrete FSH and LH into the blood. FSH, follicle-stimulating hormone, stimulates the growth of an ovarian follicle in the ovary. The follicle consists of a developing egg cell surrounded by cells that nourish and protect it. The developing follicle begins secreting estrogen, a female sex hormone. Estrogen shapes development of the female reproductive system and female secondary sex characteristics such as broad hips and development of the breasts. Its immediate role is to stimulate regrowth of the lining of the uterus in preparation for possible pregnancy. Low levels of estrogen also exert negative feedback on the hypothalamus, keeping blood levels of FSH and LH relatively low. Basically what is going on here is that the brain triggers development of an egg, and the follicle containing the egg signals the uterus to prepare to support the development of an embryo. Negative feedback assures that only one follicle develops at a time. As the follicle grows, it secretes more and more estrogen. This stimulates further development and thickening of the uterine lining. Estrogen level reaches a peak just before the midpoint of the cycle. Now response of the hypothalamus and pituitary to estrogen reverses. The higher level of estrogen actually stimulates the hypothalamus to signal the pituitary to secrete a burst of FSH and LH. It is the burst of LH that triggers ovulation on about day 14 of the cycle. The ovum develops, the follicle ruptures, and the nearly mature ovum is released from the follicle and swept into the oviduct. LH, or luteinizing hormone, also causes the ruptured follicle to develop into a glandular structure called the corpus luteum. After ovulation, the corpus luteum continues to secrete estrogen and increasing amounts of a second female hormone called progesterone. Both hormones contribute to further thickening of the uterine lining in preparation for possible pregnancy. Estrogen and progesterone also exert negative feedback on the hypothalamus and pituitary, suppressing FSH and LH secretion. This keeps additional follicles from developing after ovulation. We can summarize ovulation and the following events like this. When the follicle is nearly mature, it signals the hypothalamus to trigger ovulation. The ruptured follicle, now called the corpus luteum, prevents additional follicles from developing and signals the uterus to prepare for implantation and development of an embryo. What happens next depends on whether the ovum is fertilized or not. If the egg is not fertilized, the corpus luteum has a short lifespan. Suppression of LH after ovulation causes the corpus luteum to degenerate. As the corpus luteum's output of estrogen and progesterone drops, two changes occur. The lining of the uterus begins to slough off, the beginning of the menstrual period and start of the next cycle. The drop in estrogen and progesterone also reduces feedback inhibition of the hypothalamus and pituitary. This triggers secretion of FSH and LH, which stimulates the development of a new follicle. So if fertilization doesn't occur, the corpus luteum degenerates. Without its hormones, the lining of the uterus breaks down and a new follicle starts to grow. If the egg is fertilized, it starts to develop and implants in the wall of the uterus. The embryo secretes a hormone called human chorionic gonadotropin, HCG for short. HCG functions like LH to signal the corpus luteum to continue its secretion of estrogen and progesterone. Later, the placenta takes over this function. Progesterone and estrogen maintain the lining of the uterus and suppress the development of any more follicles. In effect, the embryo signals the corpus luteum to stick around, maintaining the uterus for embryonic development and stopping the monthly cycle. Human reproduction is complicated. It depends on precise coordination of the ovaries and uterus in response to hormonal signals orchestrated by the brain.
After a human female has about 500 cycles, they'll undergo what's called menopause, and that's where you stop ovulating and you stop menstruating. You probably heard of that. Menopause is very unusual among animals. Most other animals have the ability to reproduce up until their last year of life. But menopause might have evolved to allow mothers to provide better care for their grandchildren and children, at least in humans. Menstrual cycles are characteristic of only humans and also of some primates. The endometrium is shed from the uterus in a bleeding called menstruation. Sexual receptivity is not limited to a time frame. Estrous cycles are characteristic of most mammals. This is when the endometrium is reabsorbed by the uterus and there's no fluid flow that occurs. Sexual receptivity is limited to the heat period. So you can only breed your dogs when they're in heat. You can only breed your livestock when they happen to be in heat. And the length and frequency of the cycles are going to vary from species to species, whereas some animals, such as the domestic cat, ovulate only upon mating. And the cat can also copulate several times, and it can actually be fertilized. The eggs can be fertilized by multiple fathers sometimes. Two reactions predominant in both sexes are vasocongestion and myotonia. Vasocongestion is the filling of tissue with blood, and then myotonia is the increased muscle tension. So the sexual response cycle has 4 phases: excitement, plateau, orgasm, and resolution. and excitement prepares in both the venous and vagina for coitus, for sexual intercourse. Direct stimulation of genitalia maintains the plateau phase and prepares the vagina to receive the sperm. Orgasm is characterized by rhythmic contractions of reproductive structures. In males, semen is first released into the urethra and then ejaculated from the urethra, and in females, the uterus and the outer vagina contract. So these things are processes that are important in reproduction, and you may not have realized that it was actually a reason why these occur. During the resolution phase, the organs would just return to their normal state. Muscles start to relax. In our final section, concept 36.4, we're looking at the development of the egg into a mature embryo. And in order to develop into a mature embryo, how fertilization happens, this thing called cleavage, gastrulation after that, and then organogenesis. So the development of the zygote through the process to become an organism. Across animal species, embryonic development involves common stages that occur in a very set order. The very first always is fertilization. Fertilization results in a zygote. Then there's a cleavage stage, which is where that zygote divides, mitotically divides into a mini-celled embryo. That embryo becomes a hollow ball of cells that's then called a blastula. So fertilization, cleavage, then a blastula forms, and then the blastula starts to undergo rearrangements and becomes a 3-layered embryo that we call a gastrula. Finally, there's organogenesis, which local changes in the cell shape and large-scale changes in cell location start to generate these very rudimentary, primitive type organs. Sea urchins are one example of a model organism, a species chosen for in-depth research in part because it's easy to study in the laboratory. So if we look at the life cycle of a frog, fertilization is occurring right here where the sperm and the egg have fused and they form a zygote. So fertilization is the process, cleavage, gastrulation, organogenesis, and then metamorphosis. These are all this, and then growth, right? I guess right here. These on the outside are the terms for what results from these processes. So sperm and egg fuse, they become fertilized. Our result is a zygote. The zygote goes through cleavage. So it starts to divide mitotically. It forms a hollow ball called a blastula. Gastrulation happens, and now we have those 3 cell layers that was formed in the blastula now start to kind of buckle in, and it starts to fill in and now becomes 3-dimensional instead of just an empty ball. And then organogenesis occurs, and then we start to see these rudimentary parts to the body. So this would be like if you go into the doctor and have a sonogram taken and you're 5, 6, 7 weeks pregnant, you're probably only going to see this. And then as more cellular reproduction occurs, you finally start to see what resembles more of a baby as it develops. Molecules and events at the egg surface play a crucial role in each step in fertilization. So sperm penetrates the protective layer around the egg. The molecules on the sperm and egg surface bind to one another. That causes a change in the egg surface to prevent polyspermy. So you don't want multiple sperms to attack one single nucleus. Once they've bound, it wants to accept only that one type, or only that one single sperm. Fertilization initiates metabolic reactions that trigger the onset of embryonic development. So this activates the egg. The sperm releases calcium, or causes the egg to release calcium, and that activates the egg and triggers cortical reaction and the slow block of the polyspermy. So that calcium activates a cortical reaction, and it blocks extra sperm from being able to fuse with the egg. Activation leads to events such as increased protein synthesis that precede the formation of this diploid nucleus. So we have to have that extra protein in order for that nucleus to develop.
See the changes in free calcium in an egg cell immediately following fertilization by a sperm cell. Simultaneous images of the fertilization event were taken using phase contrast microscopy to show the cell left and calcium green fluorescence microscopy to reveal areas of free calcium right. Notice how a wave of free calcium moves quickly across the cell, starting at the point of sperm entry in the upper right. Credit: Mark Terasaki, University of Connecticut Health Center. Watch as cortical granules fuse with the egg cell plasma membrane immediately following fertilization by a sperm cell. These images were made using a lipophilic dye that binds to the membranes of the granules, allowing us to see individual fusion events. Notice how these fusion events, which are triggered by calcium, sweep across the egg surface immediately following sperm entry at the upper left. Credit: Mark Terasaki, University of...
After fertilization, cleavage occurs. And so this is where we have rapid cell growth rapid cell division without actual growth. So we have our one big fused cell, and now we get this cell growth, but it's really not changing in size. Cleavage partitions the cytoplasm of one large cell into many smaller cells. And then a blastula is formed. And a blastula is just a ball of cells with a fluid-centered cavity. The blastula is the actual thing. The inside of it is called the blastocele. And the blastula is produced after about 5 to 7 cleavage divisions. And so here's an image of this fertilized egg, and then it starts to divide, and you notice that the individual cells get smaller, and eventually it just forms this little hollow tube. Conception is fertilization of the egg by the sperm. It occurs in the oviduct in humans. Sperm binds and triggers that cortical reaction, and then polyspermy occurs, or the block of polyspermy occurs. The zygote begins cleavage after about 24 hours and produces a blastocyte after about 4 more days. So, when is this life forming? That's a good question to ask because, the zygote, should everything go right, will become a human, right? So is it at the point of conception, or is it after it goes through gastrulation or organization, the development of organs? A few days later, the embryo will implant into the endometrium of the uterus where it will stay and develop. The condition of carrying one or more embryos in the uterus is called gestation or pregnancy. Human pregnancy, their gestation is about 38 weeks from the time of fertilization. And this varies among mammals from as little as 21 days in some rodents to more than 600 days in elephants. So almost 2 years before elephants finally give birth, which is why there are fewer of them, because they don't reproduce as quickly. After cleavage, the cell rate of division will start to slow down, and the remaining stages of embryonic development are responsible for something called morphogenesis. So cellular and tissue-based processes of the body starts to take shape. We start to morphologically look more like a living, breathing human or animal, whatever it is becoming, whatever species you're talking about. During gastrulation, a set of cells at or near the surface of the blastula will start to move to an interior location. So it starts to kind of, you still have our outer layer, but it will start to kind of buckle in, and cell layers will start to get formed. And so this is the start of digestive tubes and also the different types of organs and cells that cover it, types of organs that occur inside and throughout our body. A hollow blastula is reorganized into 2 or 3 layered embryo called a gastrula. The cell layers produced by gastrulation are called our germ layers. So we have an ectoderm, an endoderm, and a mesoderm. Ectoderms are outer layers, endo is inside, inner, and then those that have bilateral symmetry will have a third germ layer called a mesoderm that's in between, meso middle, endo inside, ecto outside. And here you can see on the bottom with the blue, yellow, and red coloring, the formation of the endo, meso, and ectoderm, how we start to see 3 different germ layers. Cell movements and interactions that form the germ layers are going to vary among species, just like many things do. One distinction is whether the mouth develops at the first opening that forms in the embryo or in the second. So sea urchins are deuterostomes. So as you're learning your favorite phylums, this is a term that's going to be something that you hopefully will have heard and will understand. We are also deuterostomes. During organogenesis, regions of the embryonic germ layers develop into these little rudimentary, primitive-looking body organs. Human gestation, of course, we divide it into 3 trimesters, about 3 months each, and each trimester characterizes, there's certain things that are happening within it. So during the first trimester, the embryo secretes hormones that signal its presence and regulate the mother's reproductive tract. Human chorionic gonadotropin acts to maintain secretion of progesterone and estrogens by the corpus luteum throughout those first few months of pregnancy. Occasionally, the embryo will split in that first month, and when an embryo splits, that results in identical twins. Fraternal twins are when 2 eggs get fertilized at the same time. So a lot of times, both of these cases can be genetic, more so identical twins a lot of times, because fraternal twins could be you're taking pregnancy hormones or something that's causing your body to release more eggs at one time. Some embryos cannot complete development due to chromosomal or abnormal or other abnormalities, and so they'll spontaneously abort, and these miscarriages occur in as many as 1/3 of all pregnancies and generally occur early on in the development, maybe even before the mother realizes that she is pregnant. During the first 2 to 4 weeks, the embryo obtains all the nutrients directly from the endometrium, directly from the blood lining the uterus. Meanwhile, the outer layer of the blastocyst, called the trophoblast, mingles with the endometrium, and that's what forms the placenta. And then there's exchange between mom and the embryo through circulatory systems, nutrients, and also immune protection. We help breathe for the baby. There's an exchange of respiratory gases and metabolic wastes. So that placenta is important for it is the lifeline to make that child develop, that baby develop. First trimester is the main period of organogenesis. So, most of the big important stuff, even though that baby is not very large, is happening during that first trimester. And during this stage, the embryo is very susceptible to damage. At 8 weeks, all it is 8 weeks, all the major structures of the adult are present in a rudimentary form in the embryo. And at 8 weeks, we can finally call that a fetus. The heartbeat begins at 4 weeks, but it can't really be detected until about 8 weeks. But a lot of people, but that's not necessarily the case if your doctor has very good equipment, right? Many of you guys have probably heard the heartbeat well before you were 8 weeks along. During the second trimester, the fetus starts to grow, it becomes very active, and mom starts to feel more fetal movements. And then during the third trimester, the baby's growing a lot. Fetal activity might decrease as it starts to fill its available space. The process of childbirth begins with labor, and this is a series of strong rhythmic contractions in the uterus that pushes the fetus out. And this is a good example of positive feedback. So it pushes the fetus, but also the placenta has to get out of the body also. So once labor begins, we have regulators, prostaglandins, and hormones that induce further contractions. Labor starts, it releases hormones that tell the other things to start releasing more and more and more of that hormone until the stimulus, which is the baby, is out. And then it stops. Once you're born, newborn infant or other mammal receives nourishment in the form of mother's milk. And this is another example of positive feedback. In response to a baby suckling, it changes the estradiol levels, and the hypothalamus tells the anterior pituitary gland to secrete something called prolactin. Prolactin makes the mammary glands produce milk. As long as that baby suckles, the body is continuing to produce milk. When the baby gets full and comes off of the mother, then that stimulation has ended and the feedback stops. So that's another example of positive feedback. Contraception is deliberately preventing pregnancy, and there are multiple methods, either preventing the development or release of eggs and sperm, keeping sperm and egg apart, or preventing the implantation of the embryo. And then you might just kind of review some of the different types of contraception. This is really public health information, right? So the rhythm method or the natural planning method is where there's temporary abstinence when conception is most likely, when ovulation is taking place, but there's still up to a 20% chance of pregnancy. Nothing is 100%. Coitus interruptus is withdrawal of the penis before ejaculation, but that's completely unreliable. And then the barrier method blocks fertilization with a pregnancy rate of less than 10%. So this would be the most effective way to prevent pregnancy. Condoms, a diaphragm. And then there are birth control methods, hormonal contraceptives that have even less than 1% contraception rate. So the most effective. So I would know the least to the most effective rates of contraception. And then a little bit about infertility and in vitro. Infertility is the inability to conceive offspring, and this affects many, many people across the United States and also worldwide. And the causes are varied, and they're equally, many people assume it's the woman's fault, but it's equally likely to affect men as it is women. Sexually transmitted diseases are the most significant preventable cause of infertility. Some forms of infertility are treatable. Sometimes all it takes is just hormone therapy that can increase sperm or egg production or egg release so that fertilization can happen. In vitro fertilization, IVF, mixes oocytes with sperms in culture dishes, and so it's not technically a test tube baby, but sperm is taken from dad, sperm is taken from mom. Fertilization occurs outside of the body, but then it's returned into the uterus in an 8-cell stage so that implantation can occur. And then also sometimes the sperm nucleus can be injected directly into the egg as well. And that's the conclusion of Chapter 36, Reproduction and Development.